Now today we saw Tesla stock rally up from yesterday's close, going up about 3.5%, and it was indeed a crazy day. For example, if you go ahead and Google Tesla news, you'll go ahead and find some bullish headlines about Tesla planning to double its size in Giga Berlin to go ahead and manufacture over 1 million vehicles per year. But then you'll also find headlines talking about Ford dropping its base price for its electric Ford F-150 by $10,000, which pretty much caused Ford stock to collapse about 5% for today's trading session. Now we saw that Elon Musk tweeted saying that the Ford Lightning is actually a good vehicle, just somewhat expensive, especially given the high interest rates these days for any kind of loan. And so we saw some good news for Tesla stock today, but along with that we also saw some bad headlines. For example, Senator Elizabeth Warren has recently written out a letter to Chairman of the FCC Gary Gensler saying that it should investigate Tesla and its board of directors for a couple of things going on with Tesla. Now, if you guys want, you could go ahead and rewind to that image where I showed you the letter and pause it and read it yourself. But I'm gonna go ahead and save you guys some time and tell you guys that it is absolutely a nothing burger. But with that said, I want to show you guys something that is the opposite of a nothing burger and something that we absolutely want to pay attention to. For example, we see here that auto loan rejections, right? The rate has been higher than the application rate over the past 12 months. Now, this is a leading indicator for a recession, right? And tighter conditions in auto loan approvals versus rejections is not a good signal for the overall economy. And so one of the things I've highlighted in yesterday's video is the fact that yes, I'm bullish on Tesla in the long term. I'm also bullish on Tesla in the short term. However, the medium term is looking a bit iffy, especially because we still have a bunch of rate hikes that has happened in 2022 that the economy has yet to really feel. And so going into 2024, which is, almost half a year from now, right, it's going to be a little bit rocky, especially because we're seeing this, tightening and credit conditions, and we're going to really see how this recession plays out. Now, I want to go ahead and highlight a couple of things with Tesla stock today, but before I do so, I want to talk about this trade idea I highlighted in the Push and Profit private group this morning. For example, this morning at 9:27 a.m. I said for today I'll be looking into getting 111 puts on AMD once it reaches higher than $117.70 for the entry, or instead of trading options, I'll simply just be shorting AMD shares. Now, if we take a look into AMD stock, we saw that in the morning it pretty much came downwards. However, it didn't hit my entry. Yet towards the middle of the day, once it reached about $117.88, it pretty much rejected there, making it perfect for an entry and executing a great trade from this morning's call out in the Push and Profit private group. Now, if you guys want access to my daily briefings where every single day I talk about what's currently going on in the economy and in the markets and what are some things we have to be aware about, along with providing my trade ideas and the reasoning behind them, make sure to check out the first links in the description below so that you don't miss out on any future daily briefings. And with that said, let's go ahead and hop into my laptop and talk a little bit more about Tesla. Alrighty, so we are officially in my laptop and we're taking a look at Tesla stock from a weekly time frame. Now, for those of you guys that are new to the channel, one of the things I often say is that, you want to have a holistic approach when it comes to trading and investing in the markets, right? I often say that, technical analysis is simply just one data point and it's not the strongest one out there. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, if you're saying that, then why are we currently looking at Tesla stock from a technical viewpoint, right? Well, here's one of the things we have to pay attention to, right? Tesla stock is slightly different from other stocks out there. Now, you may be wondering, well, why is that? Why is it different from one stock to another? Well, I want to highlight something that is quite notable when it comes to looking at Tesla stock in comparison to other stocks. For example, when we take a look at the institutional ownership for Tesla, right, we see that it has about 44% of it owned by institutions in comparison to other mega cap stocks like Microsoft that has an institutional ownership of 73%. So this means that, Tesla is mostly held by retail, right? We often see that Tesla is a favored stock amongst retail. And one of the things we have to understand is that, being that retail owns the majority of Tesla stock, retail also often only looks at technicals, right? They don't look at several other data points as other institutions do, right? For example, hedge funds, they're not just looking at squiggly lines on a chart, right? They're looking at the fundamentals of a stock, right? They're looking at catalyst events. They're looking at the macroeconomic conditions. They're looking at fiscal policy, monetary policy, alternative data. I mean, the list goes on the different types of data points that institutions look at, right? They have the funds and the amounts of people to do much more research into a company, but retail, they don't have that advantage. And so what retail heavily relies on is looking at the technicals. That's pretty much one of the only data points they look at. And so with that said, one of the things I want to highlight with Tesla stock is that if we only focus, right, on the technicals and we zoom in, it looks like Tesla is kind of getting close to this trend line. In fact, or just descending trend line. In fact, we see that Tesla pretty much almost touched it and then kind of came down a little bit with that, right? So that's honestly something that's quite notable. However, I also want to highlight one of the biggest catalyst events happening this week is going to be the earnings for Tesla. In fact, if we actually scroll down, we see that we have earnings for a few other banks like Goldman Sachs, Netflix, and then of course Tesla. Now in the previous video, I mentioned how it isn't, important to definitely pay attention to the earnings for the other financial institutions. We already talked about JP Morgan and Wells Fargo and why it was important to really parse through the earnings and really talk about the forward guidance from the financial institutions, because we want to understand how credit lending is actually doing, right? Are we seeing more defaults, right? Because that wouldn't be good for the overall economy, right? Even if the banks have good earnings, well, if they're telling us, hey, we're kind of having to close down accounts because, people are getting charged off on their accounts and people aren't paying their loans, well, we know that's not a good signal, right? And so that's why, although I'm bullish on Tesla stock in the long term, I say it all the time, really just based off the fundamentals, and I say I'm bullish on Tesla stock in the short term based on a few other data points. One of my main concerns, right, is heading into 2024 when we actually start feeling pressure onto the economy. Now, I mentioned it earlier in the beginning of the video, but I really just kind of want to explain this a little bit further. And I showed it in yesterday's video, but I want to go ahead and really just hone on it again. So I know I'm showing this again, but there's a reason why I'm reiterating this, right? So if we take a look at the previous rate hikes, we see that in 2022 was when we started having the Federal Reserve hike interest rates, right? Now, it takes oftentimes approximately 1 year for the economy to feel the rate hikes, right? The impacts and changes in monetary policy. And so with that said, we've only really felt about 3 rate hikes. We felt the 25 basis point hike, the 50 basis point hike, and then the 75 basis point hike. Now, if you were to add all these rate hikes up together and then divide the amount that we so far have felt, we've only really felt 30% of the rate hikes that the Federal Reserve has done. We still have an additional 75 basis points and, again, 75, 75, 50, 25, 25, and 25. And there's a 92% consensus that going forward on the next meeting in July 26th, that the Federal Reserve is going to hike an additional 25 basis points. And so, there's a lot of concern that we're still going to feel more heat and pressure into the overall market. And so, although Tesla's still able to, achieve its goals and beat its deliveries, and we may see Tesla even beat its earnings, that's all good for the short term, and everything so far is looking good for the long term. However, the real issue is the headwind, right? The economic headwinds coming into, next year to 2024 when we actually start to feel the pain into the overall markets. And so that's something I've been warning individuals in the Push and Profit private group. I also recently sent out a newsletter, which is completely free. If you guys want to join the newsletter, make sure to, again, check out the links in the description below, because not only can you join the Push and Profit private group, there's also an option to join my free weekly newsletter. And in last week's newsletter, I highlighted that a Nobel Prize economist has recently argued that, it makes no sense for the Federal Reserve to hike an additional 25 basis points. And it's really in sync with some of the, things that I've mentioned recently to the Push and Profit private group, that it honestly does not make sense to hike. However, at the end of the day, one of the things we have to acknowledge is that neither me nor the Nobel Prize winning economists make the decisions on monetary policy, right? So if the Federal Reserve is dead on still hiking rates, despite, award-winning economists saying this is a bad idea, well, we can't just, just be blind to that. We have to really just prepare ourselves as market participants and understand what's going on. And so for Tesla stock in the short term, obviously one of the things I'm doing is still buying long. I'm buying calls and trading upwards. And also in my long-term portfolio, one of the things I'm doing is just waiting for a dip, right? And then once there's a dip, waiting for that confirmation of an uptrend and buying more. Now, I say this very often. I always highlight this quote from Warren Buffett that goes something like this. He says, be fearful when everyone's greedy, and be greedy when everyone is fearful, right? And so with Tesla stock rallying up this much, I haven't honestly bought more into my long-term portfolio, right? I did buy a few when we had the dip right over here and we saw a confirmation of an uptrend, but relatively speaking, I haven't been able to buy too many shares of Tesla this year, simply because to me it doesn't make sense to continue buying Tesla as it continues rallying up. I want to wait for the pressure of Tesla to go down, and once we see Tesla stock going down and then showing signs in the uptrend, that's when I want to add more in. Now, of course, there's several different approaches that you can take for your long-term or short-term trading and investing. For example, some individuals who invest long-term, they dollar cost average differently, where they add a, pretty much determined amount equally each month, and that's completely fine as well. That's not my approach, but one of the things I try to highlight on this channel is that you should never trade or invest based on anyone else's opinion or their own, decisions on what they do, including myself, right? I need to hold myself accountable that, although I've been right for Tesla so far for this entire year, actually going back into last year as well when we started seeing this massive downtrend, that doesn't mean that I'm going to be right, all the time, right? There's going to be times where I'm going to be completely wrong, and that's completely fine. And so I do want to warn you guys that you guys should not follow whatever I'm doing exactly in my short-term trading account or in my long-term trading account unless you guys see value. If you guys find any value and agree with what I'm saying and you do your due diligence, then that's completely fine. But I do want to warn you guys to not just blindly copy me, right? Now, with that disclosure, out of the way, one of the things I want to highlight is that when we're looking at Tesla stock from a technical perspective, one of the things I've highlighted recently is looking at the volume profile, right? I say this very often that when we're looking at Tesla and looking at the volume profile, when there's very little volume to price, that's when we see the biggest movements going up or down. And that's simply because when there's little volume to price, that means that there's no battle between the bid and the ask. And so if there's a lot of buying pressure, a stock will push upwards, and vice versa. If there's a lot of selling pressure and there's little volume to price, a stock will push downwards. So to give you guys an example of this, notice where there's the biggest amounts of volume to price right over here on the chart. We see that Tesla stock pretty much consolidated, moving sideways. There were supports and resistances, and that's because people are buying and selling very often. And so when there's lots of volume to price, well, it doesn't give any big movements in the order book. Yet when we see over here where there's little volume to price and we see that there's strong amounts of buying pressure, we see that Tesla stock flew up around this range over here, right? And then we also see that highlighted again over here where we see, hey, there's little volume to price, there's a lot of selling pressure, Tesla stock falls down. We see that when there's a lot of volume to price over here, that is pretty much where we move sideways. But where are we currently right now with Tesla? We're at this area where there's little volume to price. And so one of the big things that we want to pay attention to, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be the earnings. If Tesla is able to beat its earnings, right? One of the major concerns is obviously gross profit margins and free cash flow because of the price cuts on their vehicles, right? But if they're still able to beat their earnings, right, we could possibly see Tesla, get more demand and buying pressure, pushing it upwards and have another spike up, getting it closer to that $400 level. Now, one of the main concerns, as I just said, was the profit margins, but we just saw that Ford is kind of having to compress their profit margins as well by decreasing the price of their Ford F-150 Lightning vehicles, right? And so that was really bullish for the market because that kind of shows us the advantage that Tesla has, which is its pricing power. See, one of the things I always say is that, it kind of sucks that Tesla's having to cut its prices and it kind of sacrificed profit margins. It had one of the best profit margins in the auto industry. But it's honestly an advantage that they're able to do that, right? Because if we're heading into a recession, but you're still able to stir up demand by being able to lower your prices, forcing the competition to lower their prices and be unprofitable, well, that's a significant advantage. I mean, in previous videos, I showed how, a lot of these legacy automakers like Ford, GM, they're entering into the EV space, but they're still not profitable, right? They're losing billions of dollars each year, and they don't expect to be profitable until 2025. And so looking at Tesla from a fundamental, perspective, I'm bullish on the long term. However, I do want to warn that there's a little bit of, an issue coming over as we get closer to 2024. But with that being said, guys, I don't want to make this video any much longer. I want to keep it short, sweet, and concise. And so I hope you guys found any utility in this video, found anything or valuable, any information. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And consider watching this next video right over here. And I'll see you guys on that next video. Take care, guys.